two bigger ones in the middle. Now, in order to do that, and they carried them, you needed more than a few people. You needed a lot of people.
Sure.
And so it was an act like that that led people to live together and therefore to begin to cultivate animals and crops in order to maintain holy shrines.
Living like a nomad is, I guess, personally, I believe is a way of life which can teach you a lot of things which education or schools will never be able to teach you. What would you say are the main key things which a person can learn from a nomad?
I mean, money.
You are giving me travel.
It encourages us to think in a very narrow. Specific way. And that's something to do with living in an urban environment. We're encouraged to specialize. You become an accountant or a lawyer or a banker or whatever it is. Rather than, as a nomad, you have to do everything.
Everything, yeah.
And every day is a surprise.
This is an ABP Live Podcast.
Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I'm Aabir Lahiry. This is Cracking Conversation, an ABP Live Podcast. Every week we try to dig deep into somebody's brain and in their life to get more wisdom from their life and their journey. Today's in conversation is Antony Sattin. He's a renowned travel writer and he's coming up with his new book called Nomads by Antony Sattin. Welcome to ABP Live Podcast. How are you, Antony?
Thank you, Aabir. I'm very, very well and happy to be here. Happy to be talking.
You recently visited Jaipur Literature Festival. This is your visit to India. How has been your visit to India this time?
Oh, it's always a pleasure. And Jaipur is always, it's a big party. And it's a big party not just the party sense, but also, the conversations, the mind. Yeah. It's super stimulating.
A lot of writers, a lot of authors.
Yes, and there's some I know, some old friends who come out from various places. But the joy is always finding people I've never heard of before, whose work I'm now carrying back in my suitcase to read when I get home. That's the thrill.
So cool. Do you read on a regular basis as a writer as well?
I read all the time.
Okay.
Yes.
You're coming up with a new book called Nomads. How exactly? A lot of people are fascinated by nomads. They always dream of becoming. A lot of millennials and Gen Z always dream of being a nomad at least for 6 months or a year. You have certainly researched a lot about the nomadic tribe. What is your observation about?
Well, you mean how did I come to it?
Yes.
Well, when I was about 19, which is there for a long time ago, as soon as I left school, I went traveling in the Middle East, and I remember I was in Sinai, which is now part of Egypt, big desert peninsula, and everybody had said be very, very careful when you go to Sinai because the nomads, the Bedouin, are going to steal from you, and coming from the UK, we don't have nomads.
True.
And I didn't speak Arabic, and I was a little bit anxious about it. But it turned out these people were absolutely charming. And rather than stealing from me, they sort of looked after me. And it's like, what is this person doing, sleeping on the beach or then sleeping in the hill? I was just sleeping rough at the time. I didn't have any money, and there were no hotels there anyway.
Wow.
And so when I got back to the UK, I thought, why do I not know anything about nomads? I mean, nobody talks about them. And so this has been percolating in my head for a long time. And I lived in Egypt for a while. And I spend 2 or 3 months every year in that part of the world. And it's nomads are part of everyday life. And if you don't see them, they're a part of the consciousness.
True.
And part of the tradition. And so I've come to the time when I wanted to write something really difficult.
Okay.
So I thought I would write a book that followed the trajectory of human habits from the time when we all lived on the move, which isn't very long ago. It's only 12,000 years ago. Almost everybody lived on the move. Well, in the greater scheme of things.
Yeah. That's true.
The human story, that's just yesterday. We all lived on the move, and now more than 50% of us live in not just settled, but urban environments. And in 2050, the statistic says 75% of us will live in urban environments. And this is a massive change. So I thought, okay, well, now is the time, and also it's a very interesting time to be writing history because everything is being questioned.
True.
So I thought, I'll write this. 12,000 years of history crammed into 200 and something pages and trace that shifting relationship between mobile people and settled people.
Since you mentioned about this equation of 12,000 years, what exactly has changed? Like for now, for a lot of people, it is more of a recreational purpose. Like travel is more of a recreation for them, rather than a way of life, which was certainly before. How exactly have we evolved with time? What has changed?
Well, there are two answers to that. One answer is some of us started gathering together in places where I think if you live as a hunter-gatherer, you can only have about 20 people per square mile. Otherwise, you eat your way out, and then you starve. So that's not very many people. So if you needed to have a big project, and I open the book 9,500 BC in a place in Turkey near the Syrian border, where around that time a group of people decided to build a holy shrine.
Okay.
And they cut limestone pillars, T-shaped, 10, 12 feet high, 12 of them in a circle, two bigger ones in the middle. Now, in order to do that, and they carried them, you needed more than a few people. You needed a lot of people.
Sure.
And so it was an act like that led people to live together and therefore to begin to cultivate animals and crops in order to maintain holy shrines. And jump forward 3,000 years and you have people living in what we would recognize as towns. And 3,000 years after that, they're living in cities, 100,000 people in a city like Memphis in Egypt. And but at the same time, nomads and hunter-gatherers have carried on doing what they've always done, and that is moving, nomads in particular, pastoralists, they tend to move between summer and winter pasture. They have flocks of goats or sheep or horses or whatever, and they need to move around. And they mostly occupy land that isn't good for agriculture, for growing crops. And here's a statistic for you. I think only about a quarter, maybe a maximum of a third, of the land that the United Nations calls agricultural land is good for growing crops, which means the majority of the agricultural land on the planet is good for people like nomads. And yet, we don't talk about them anymore. We think they've gone. They haven't gone. They're still doing exactly what they've always done. They are the great survivors. The Indus Valley civilization came and went. The ancient Egyptians, the Romans, the British Empire came and went. Nomads are still doing what they've always done.
Where can we find them?
Here in India, for instance, in Rajasthan, up on the edge of the deserts, for instance, and they move into the desert in the winter when it's cooler and there's grazing for their animals, and then in the summer they'll move out.
Okay.
But they're all over the world. In Europe, for instance, we have what are called transhumants. So down near the Mediterranean, in Spain and in France, they move huge amounts of animals up and down from the plains, summer and winter, for instance.
Wow, so cool. Since you mentioned about this urban exodus of people, do you see a silver lining where people are actually going back to the rural roots?
I think inevitably, and I think I mentioned this statistic of 75% of us are going to live in urban environments, and for most people that's living in a box.
Small rooms,
and yet 12,000 years in the human story, as I said, is just yesterday. So for many of us, the idea of living in the same surroundings day after day is very difficult. And there's been some very interesting research done by geneticists in the United States who found in successful nomads in East Africa have because not all nomads are very successful. Some do better.
Oh, what is the definition? What is the definition of success for a nomad?
How much food do you have, and how big is your flock? If you have a big flock, then you can feed yourself better, and you get richer, and your flock grows.
Okay.
So it's not a level field. But the successful ones, this research found, have one particular variant of a gene that the others don't have. And these same researchers found the same gene in children in the United States who were diagnosed with learning difficulties. Now, the suggestion is that these children are just simply not wired to sit in a classroom, be at home. That if you put them in a different environment, in the environment that we all used to live in, that they would flourish.
Yeah.
And the idea behind that is that most of our education now encourages us to think in a very narrow. Specific way. And that's something to do with living in an urban environment. We're encouraged to specialize, you become an accountant or a lawyer or a banker or whatever it is, rather than as a nomad, you have to do everything.
Everything, yeah.
And every day is a surprise. You can't, because you're absolutely at the mercy of the natural world, of the elements, of other animals, of other people. So every day you have to come up with a range of solutions to problems you can't foresee. So in a way you have variant thinking, nomadic thinking I write about, as opposed to settled thinking. True. And I think now, the way we're going, we absolutely need nomadic thinking. We need new ideas. We need new ways of looking at things. We need...
True. No, living like a nomad is, I guess personally, I believe is a way of life which can teach you a lot of things which education or schools will never be able to teach you. What would you say are the main key things which a person can learn from a nomad?
Oh, well, the most obvious thing, if we're talking about nomads with animals,
yeah,
is these are people who are still, as I mentioned, absolutely in touch with and in harmony with the natural world. It's not in their interest to destroy their environment because they need it.
Yeah.
And we who live in cities, and I was born in the middle of London, it's very difficult to have a relationship with the natural world. True. I mean, half the time you don't even know what the weather's like. Yeah. It's we've completely lost touch. Yeah. So I think that's something that nomads can absolutely teach us, and a respect with, but also harmony with the natural world. And it's something that I'm trying to engage with now. I've moved out of the city. I now live in the countryside. I live surrounded by, very, very few people. I hear animals. I don't hear people. And obviously this is a privilege. Okay. But I'm not alone in wanting to do this.
True. A lot of people want to do it. What kind of perspective change does it bring to you? What kind of a fundamental change you have noticed inside you when you have moved to a countryside?
Well, when you go back in the city, it's very noisy and very crowded and very slow. I mean, and I thought life in the woods was slow, because in a way it is. But actually, time goes so quickly because there's so much to do, and also because I'm a city boy, there's so much to learn.
Yeah.
But what am I learning? I'm learning. My eyesight is better. My smell is better. My hearing is better. Because actually when we live in the city, we close things. We're constantly closing things off. There are things we don't want to hear. We don't want to smell. We don't want to see.
True.
And when you live in the natural world, you want to see and hear and smell everything.
True.
That's one thing.
It brings you closer to the nature.
Yes, I feel more alive.
So cool. I was reading about these Polynesian geographers, I don't know what you call them, who used to navigators who used to use stars and moons and clouds, and they were so close to the nature that they had their own ecosystem of maps. They used to navigate through the Pacific Ocean.
There was a wonderful book written by a Harvard professor called The Lost Art of Finding Our Way, which was exactly about these people, the Polynesians, yes. Well, but we all used to do this before we had our phones.
So true.
Tell us where we are and how to before.
But I guess phone will still not be sufficient to navigate through the Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean.
Well, no, but for instance, in order to navigate where I now live, there's no connection.
Yeah.
And so, well, there is in the house, but once I leave the house, there's no phone. So
no network, nothing?
No. I mean, I have it in the house, but not outside the house.
Peaceful.
So you go for a walk and get lost, and it's and I think, okay, so which way was the sun? When which way is east, which way is west? And I'm slowly trying to teach myself how to move around, because otherwise it's just mile after mile after mile of woods.
Wow, so cool. What kind of animals do you visit visit you?
Oh, we have deer that come by, and wild boar, and some wild dogs as well.
Very
obviously cool. A little bit less welcome, the wild dogs.
Okay. You've always been attracted to travel writing. Yes. What brought you into this? What kind of experiences made you a hardcore travel writer?
hunger. I was writing fiction. I started out writing short stories and then novels, and I literally just sort of got very hungry and very skinny and very sad, sitting in a room day after day. And I had the opportunity to. I dreamt up a book that was going to take me around the world. And out of that came, I just got very lucky. The Sunday Times in London asked if I would go traveling for them. And I said, wait, you're going to give me money.
You are giving me travel.
I can go wherever I want and do what I want. And yeah,
Why not?
so for many, many years, I just dreamt up these stories that I wanted to go and write. And then they happened. And you know, and I took my time, I went slowly. I mean, now this sort of thing isn't really possible, but at that, I was just there at the happy moment. And I would say, you know, I'd like to go for 3 or 4 weeks to Sumatra, for instance, looking for a river that is mentioned in Lord Jim in Joseph Conrad's novel. And the editor says, oh, okay, that sounds like a good idea. And here's some money and off you go. It's fantastic.
Which is the craziest experience you've had as a travel writer?
That was pretty far out. That was, you know, arrive in Sumatra saying, well, I'm looking for this river that was mentioned in a novel. And there's people...
But does it actually exist?
It was the most exciting... No, it does. Yes, it does happen. It was the most exciting thing because... I've come with the idea of this novel in my head. And I'm trying to match it up to reality. So the story of Lord Jim is this terrible thing happens to him and he wants to go and hide away at the end of the world. And he goes to the far side of Sumatra, although it's not mentioned as Sumatra in the book. And he goes up this river, and he becomes a friend of the local Raja, who's a pepper trader, and selling pepper to the Europeans, to the Dutch and the British.
Okay.
So this is in the 1800s. And so this is the backstory of it. And it turns out that there's a real story that happened, which is how Joseph Conrad, the novelist, got the idea for this. So I turn up on this river and say, I'm looking for the Raja's palace. And someone says, well, the palace was washed away by a flood about 20 years ago, but the Raja is still here. Would you like to meet him? I said, yeah, okay. So we go and meet the Raja, and he sits outside and we're surrounded by about 50 people. And he tells the story of the real incident that happened in the 1800s that the novelist Joseph Conrad heard about and then made into his novel. So you've got sort of layer upon layer.
Wow.
And I just, you know, that sort of moment is a sort of thing that makes me very happy, both as a traveler but as a writer as well.
Have you been to North Korea, like Somalia, that kind of place?
I've been to some dangerous places.
Yeah.
You mean? I've been to quite a few dangerous places. But I'm not. I mean, early on, I walked through the Holy Land, through Israel and Palestine, from Nazareth to Bethlehem, in the footsteps of Joseph and Mary and Jesus. And but it happened to be the first Intifada. So the Palestinians were fighting against the Israelis, but and it happened to actually be the first anniversary of the outbreak of it, which I had no idea. I mean, I was just a writer. What did I know? Yeah. So I start walking in a straight line.
This is which year? This is
a long time. This is 1988, 89, and I end up in a war zone. I mean, there are people shooting each other, and the Israeli army are moving around in their armored vehicles, and there's smoke everywhere, and people are being wounded, and the only other foreigners are war journalists. You know, and a couple of days later, I meet some of them in a hotel in Jerusalem, and they're all, you know, pumped up. They've got great stories, the adrenaline's there, and I'm just thinking, this is not me. This is so not me. So that was the moment I decided I'd try and stay out of war zones.
But that must be fun. Like, it's a coincidence.
Nobody was just
coincidence.
It was just stupid, and you know, and you know, there's something about the way I look, which is sort of. Well, okay, so the Israelis, when I was crossing over into Palestinian territory, said, you shouldn't go because they're going to think you're one of us. And then, of course, when I get to the other side, the Palestinians are saying to me, watch out, because the Israelis are going to think you're one of us. And I'm everybody's target at that point, so.
Oh, man, that must be scary.
Yeah, but anyway, I've been to
this is before the shrine was shifted to a new place?
This is when, which shrine? No, it was, it's still the current problem. It was there. But for instance, in Algeria, I mean, where they were slitting the throats of journalists, and again, I arrived because I was writing a story, and I hadn't really thought through the consequences until this man who was driving me from the airport said, how many exits does your hotel have? And I said, I have no idea. I've never even thought about it. He said, well, you need to know.
How many?
Entrance. How many doors into the hotel? He said, because you need to make sure that every single one of them is guarded at night, because otherwise someone is coming for you. There were no other foreigners walking around there at the time.
Oh, man.
So, yeah, but anyway.
Every job has a lot of things to pay for. Oh,
Yeah.
that must be scary.
Well, I survived. It's all right.
Yeah. What's your message to all those people who will be looking for this book and would be reading it very soon?
Read it.
What experience there?
Okay, I think we're living through a really interesting time in writing of history, and mostly this book is a history book. It's a string of stories across this 12,000 years. And, 250 years ago, when the first English dictionary was composed, the word nomad was not in it because it was entirely irrelevant. Nobody used the word. Yep. And yet now, we all talk about the word nomad and digital nomads and all sorts of other nomads. So there is in this story something for all of us who feel restless, who think that maybe one day I'm going to head out of here and go and have another life somewhere else. And this meditation of the shifting relations between settled and nomadic people. And it's also it was called, what was it called? It was an ode to mobility. Okay. It's a protest about the fact that our world is increasingly a world of borders and barriers. And so this is the best times in our history in the last 12,000 years have been the times when people can move around freely, share ideas, meet each other, not get scared about the people next door.
True.
And so I think for that reason,
it's
a good read.
I completely relate to this chain of thought, this school of thoughts, and I am definitely going to read all of it because I am a person who's always on the road, and I certainly cherish whatever you have written. I'll surely read the entire copy and.
Well, there's an audiobook as well.
Oh, very cool.
Which I read. So you can have me read to you.
So cool. On that note, thank you very much for talking to ABP Live Podcast. It was wonderful to have a chat with you.
Thank you, Aabir. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Cracking Conversations ka brand new episode. I'm Aabir Lahiry. Thank you very much.
This is an ABP Live Podcast.